Okay, welcome everyone, and thanks for joining us tonight. As Caitlin already introduced, my name is Kelsey, and I use she, her pronouns. I'm a Master's of Social Work student at the University of Toronto, and I've been at Sheena's place since September, completing my practicum here. So today we're going to be discussing diet and exercise culture amongst youth and children, and my interest in bringing light to this topic stemmed from my previous work with youth and mental health, where I've seen a big need for eating disorder prevention and awareness. So I wanted to start off with a land acknowledgement. As we learn and reflect about eating disorders and people's relationships with food, it's important that we recognize the systemic violence that some communities on the land we call Canada have faced and still face today. First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people often had their traditional methods of procuring food and their relationship with the land forcefully altered through the process of settler colonization. The residential school system aimed to sever these connections amongst children with exploitative processes and treaties that weren't upheld, creating the conditions for poverty that many unfortunately still live in to this day. As of September 2020, 44 boiling water advisories remain in 32 communities, impacting these communities' ability to prepare and engage with food. As a charity that provides support to those with body image issues and eating disorders, Sheena's Place acknowledges that First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people are often left out of the body image and eating disorder spaces, including research, treatment, recovery spaces, and conversations surrounding stigma and support. It's our responsibility to work towards decolonizing these spaces and to create supportive environments for all folks who desire support. As a non Indigenous settler, I see acknowledging these truths and actively working towards reconciliation as critical, especially in the context of learning about mental health, food, and the ways in which these things interact. You can check out this slide here for a few resources, and the links are clickable. So I wanted to begin just by providing an overview of tonight. So we are going to be defining diet and exercise culture, and then highlighting the prevalence and severity of related issues, continuing on to review the relationship with mental health and eating disorders, followed by the ways in which we can be resisting diet and exercise culture, as well as looking at how to be anti-diet and combat harmful messages. And then we'll also take a brief look at the advocacy side of the topic and conclude with some relevant resources. So before we get started, I did want to preface the presentation with a few items. The first being self-care during the presentation. So some of the content during tonight's presentation might be difficult for some, as it might relate to personal experiences. And it's very normal to feel uncomfortable when discussing these topics. Some of them are universal and also very private. So if you are feeling any discomfort, feel free to step away or reach out to Caitlin via chat if needed. And then please ask questions either throughout the presentation via chat, or you can save them for the end. There'll be probably 5 to 10 minutes allotted at the very end of the presentation for me to address any questions that were asked in the chat, as well as any others. And then I also wanted to note that we do only have 1 hour together, and so there's not going to be any age-specific information, more so just generalized information regarding adolescents and youth. And then I also wanted to provide a disclaimer regarding the slide deck, as it is made available to you via the email you received with the Zoom link tonight, and will be provided afterwards as well. The slide deck should be used in conjunction with my presentation. The slides are merely bullet points to a lot of the information that I'm going to be sharing tonight. So I wanted to start tonight with providing some definitions, just because I'll be referencing some of these words throughout tonight's presentation, some of which you might be familiar with, and then some you might not. So fat phobia is the first one, which is defined as the irrational fear of and aversion to fatness. The second one is weight stigma, which is discrimination and or stereotyping based on somebody's body size. There's also thin privilege, which is a set of inherent advantages that living in a thin body provides a person in our society. And then lastly, body image, which is a person's attitude towards and perception of their body. And this oftentimes is viewed as fluid and ever-changing, so it can move between positive, negative, and or neutral. So in terms of defining the problem, I wanted to start off with a definition of diet culture. So diet culture is generally looked at as a system of beliefs that is firstly dominated by the idolization of thinness. So there's a placement of thinness as the pinnacle of success and beauty, and it assumes that eating in a certain way will result in the right body size or the correct body size. And thinness is viewed as simply attainable for anyone who has the right willpower or determination. Um, Diet culture is also a system of beliefs that projects morality surrounding food choice and body size, as well as promoting weight loss as a means of attaining a higher status. And lastly, diet culture oppresses people who don't match up with its supposed picture of health, which disproportionately harms women, femmes, trans folks, people in larger bodies, racialized people, and people with disabilities, damaging both their mental and physical health. Diet culture is also generalized by sort of these characteristics here. The first being the sort of black and white, all or nothing dichotomous thinking. And so, in reality, nutrition is very nuanced and dynamic, and it's meant to be something that's really flexible and inclusive. And so, the right choice when deciding on food is always circumstantial. There's a lot of information to gather and process when making food decisions. And so, what sounds good, what you have access to, what your body feels, what would match what your body's asking for, combinations of the different amounts of food that will fuel you best, your schedule, what the people you're around are wanting to eat if that's applicable, and then also different possible health conditions or medical concerns. And so health and well-being is far more personal and individualized, and it's actually quite the opposite of the very stringent rules that diet culture usually puts forth. Another component of diet culture is that it pathologizes body shape and size. And so, we don't have time to go into detail tonight about the health at every size approach, but it is important to acknowledge that weight is not an indicator of health in any way. And there's a lot of roots of diet culture that are in, BMI charts. And it's important to note that BMI is not necessarily a legitimate diagnostic tool, though it is still used. Diet culture often also uses stigmatizing language to describe body size, such as normal, overweight, or obese, just like the BMI charts do. And then thirdly, diet culture uses external rules and guidelines for how, when, and what to eat. So often when there are rules or guidelines for when, where, what to eat, it's likely diet culture. And there are exceptions to this, such as religious and or ethical guidelines or items like that. But generally, in reality, once again, health and nutrition is about eating in a very connected and attuned way to yourself and your food. And diet culture is what's making these attempts at having you disconnect from yourself and simply follow the rules. And so, diet culture has become really synonymous with health and nutrition. And so as a result, we kind of learn a lot about food and eating and nutrition and health and weight all through the lens of diet culture. So next, we're going to be looking at exercise culture and defining that as a concept. And it's another aspect of this sort of overarching health culture where there's more blatant toxicity that's rampant in the fitness and exercise space. So toxic fitness culture has generally been defined as social characteristics, language, and habits that promote and or reinforce ableism, fat phobia, racism, classism, elitism, body shaming and policing, LGBTQIA plus hatred, and that's all under the guise of fitness and wellness. And it's also a belief that really thrives on shame and judgment and sort of elitist ideologies. And exercise culture can show up and look like many things, some of which being this sort of promotion of fitness for the sole purpose of weight loss. It also encourages the belief that fitness and health equates thinness. And lastly, it promotes this idea that exercise is a moral activity. So I just wanted to provide some more, tangible examples of what diet and exercise culture might look like and how it can show up. So there's this idea of labeling foods, associating with worth with what or how you eat, ignoring body cues, eliminating food groups, food guilt, food anxiety, food rules, associating worth with how you look, equating thinness with health, complementing weight loss, food labels giving one permission to eat, feeling the need to justify your eating, avoiding foods too high in fats, carbs, and or calories, exercise being used for punishment, and avoiding social situations because of food. And of course, this isn't an exhaustive list, but it does illustrate the variety of ways in which, our thoughts and behaviors can demonstrate diet culture beliefs and principles. So now that we've covered a lot of the defining characteristics of these concepts, I wanted to share some background information to emphasize the pervasiveness of these issues. And so to begin, diet culture is really everywhere. Parents are given a lot of pressure to feed their children perfectly and to raise good eaters and healthy people. Doctors, dietitians, policymakers, general healthcare providers are also individuals that live in diet culture as well, and they work within fat-phobic medical systems themselves. Teachers are provided curriculum that incorporates nutrition education, often with the intent of avoiding kids from, gaining too much weight. And so, it's really important to note that a lot of these ideas stem from fat phobic sentiments, and there's this belief that fatness is inherently bad and it's to be avoided and prevented at all costs. It should also be noted, again, with this notion of diet and exercise culture being everywhere, that a lot of mainstream healthy eating advice is, though it's mostly well-intentioned, it's heavily influenced by diet culture. So additionally, 35% of occasional dieters progress into chronic dieting, and as many as 25% lead to diagnosable eating disorders. Americans spend billions of dollars annually trying to attain what diet culture promises, almost to no avail. According to market research, the total US weight loss market grew at an estimated 4.1% in 2018 to $72.7 billion and is forecasted to grow 2.6% annually through to 2023. And with that kind of money and with that kind of industry at stake, it's really hard to get that to just go away, even with an ever-growing and powerful movement such as the anti-diet movement. And a final stat to sort of illustrate the inescapability of diet culture and its consequences is that 39% of American women say concerns about what they eat or what they weigh interfere with their happiness. And again, this is just highlighting the extreme concern that's placed on weight and body size that's experienced in North America. And so in the context of children, raising happy, well-rounded youth has become even more challenging in these times where youth are inundated with, harmful messages regarding food and nutrition, exercising and weight. And so nurturing a neutral or positive body image is crucial, but our society is especially fixated on youth and beauty, where beauty has a very small and narrow definition. Research actually shows that kids begin equating fat with bad between the ages of 3 and 5. 1 in 4 children have engaged in some type of dieting behavior by age 7, and 80% of 10-year-old American girls have been on a diet. And these dieting behaviors are also often partnered with negative body image, where more than half of girls and approximately 1/3 of boys aged 6 to 8 indicate that their ideal bodies are, thinner than their current one. Additionally, over 50% of teenage girls and 33% of teenage boys are using restrictive measures to lose weight at any given time. And I also wanted to make note of the fact that there is a lot of lacking research on diet culture and its impacts on trans and non-binary youth. And so I didn't necessarily have a lot of statistics to provide of that population for this portion here, but I wanted it to be known that trans and non-binary youth are equally as affected in these spaces. And so with all of this being said, we all have a relationship with food that began in childhood and has been influenced by our experiences and our familial and cultural messages throughout life. And so the spectrum can range from relaxed and balanced to complete preoccupation and disordered eating behaviors and patterns. So when we're looking at who diet culture and who exercise culture harms, anti-diet advocates argue that diet culture harms everyone with a body, especially because weight stigma and thin privilege are both very real, and therefore no one is safe from feeling othered by diet culture. Diet culture does particularly harm people in larger bodies. It has a very distinct way of deluding people into believing that people in larger bodies are open to public scrutiny, judgment, and comment, as well as inciting, stigmatization, bullying, and oppression of people in larger bodies. And that includes, being excluded from public spaces, being hired, paid, and promoted less, and being unable to access competent, bigotry-free healthcare. Diet culture also harms those with a predisposition for currently suffering with or are recovering from an eating disorder. And as mentioned before, diet culture harms marginalized groups, so it oppresses, again, people that don't match up with the supposed picture of health, which disproportionately harms women, femmes, trans folks, people in larger bodies, racialized people, and people with disabilities, damaging both mental and physical health. So the idea that thinner bodies are better bodies is rooted in anti-Blackness and harms people of all sizes, but mostly harms those in the largest bodies and those with multiple marginalized identities. And so in terms of the anti-Black racism that occurs within diet and exercise culture, again, I don't really have the time nor the expertise to address the entire history in tonight's webinar, but I will be sharing resources at the end of the presentation for those who are interested in learning more about the connection between the two. And so, with this list, it's really significant to note that a lot of these identities can and do intersect, and especially with marginalized groups. So many of these issues can be compounded, and people obviously don't neatly fit into one of these categories that are listed here, and so they can overlap. And then the last point, which is the center of our presentation tonight, is children and youth who are also affected by diet and exercise culture. So, given the universal confusion around diet and exercise culture, it's really important for us to define exactly why it's harmful. So the first point being that it promotes discrimination. So mocking and bullying of people in larger bodies is often a part of diet culture that's harmful. Beyond that, weight-based discrimination can actually impact access to jobs, healthcare, and more. Stigma and discrimination towards people in larger bodies is pervasive and therefore threatens their psychological and physical health, thus creating health disparities and contributing to overarching social justice issues. And then in an attempt to gain equal access, people in larger bodies are oftentimes led to these diets that further inflict harm, again, both physically and mentally. Diet culture also is harmful because it fuels businesses that are designed for profit. So as I mentioned before, the total US weight loss market is upwards of $70 billion and growing. And so billions of dollars are spent annually on attempting to attain what diet culture promises. And so again, even with these anti-diet movements, the amount of money that's invested into the weight loss market makes it really impossible to remove and makes it really harmful. Diet culture also distracts from larger societal issues. So our culture promotes this idea that if you're not thin, it's both a problem and your fault. So being in a larger body is not the actual problem, but diet culture says that it is because it's easier than investing money and energy into giving everyone access to fresh food and ample outdoor space to move, connect, and enjoy nature. And so if we lived in a society where neighborhoods were walkable and people could get access to clean drinking water and plenty of sleep, people would actually be far healthier than they are now. But diet culture gives permission to point the finger at the individual rather than focusing on the larger structural issues that have a global impact on populations. Diet culture also normalizes disordered eating. So eating disorders are a clinically diagnosable condition, of course, but disordered eating behaviors are much more prevalent and are actually promoted by diet culture, where, again, weight is highlighted as this center of health. And then lastly, diet and exercise culture is very self-perpetuating. So dieters are often left to berate themselves when diets don't work and then continue to do what diet culture teaches them. So regardless of how much the diet doesn't work, individuals will still blame themselves rather than the diet, and that just sort of continues as a cycle. So oftentimes, again, it's stemming from all this confusion, but it's really important we're looking at the ways in which we might be perpetuating and why we're perpetuating diet and exercise culture. And again, the first being, misinformation or conflicting messages. The perpetuation also stems from this strong desire to want both yourself and your loved ones to be healthy. And so many times in the context of wanting our children and children we love to be physically healthy is sort of the source of why this often is perpetuated. There's also this idea that by applying many of the diet and exercise culture norms, we're protecting ourselves and our loved ones from discrimination via weight stigma and fat phobia. It's also common for individuals to be projecting their own internalized fear of fatness or their own fat phobia when perpetuating diet and exercise culture. It's also important to note that despite the many harms diet and exercise culture do present, many of the individuals who perpetuate such ideas do have good intentions and are unknowingly contributing to the misinformation or confusing messages that do exist. And especially for parents, there's a lot of messages regarding nutrition and healthy eating and exercise requirements, and it can be very confusing. And so it puts a lot of people in difficult positions when there's so many conflicting messages, and many of us are just attempting to do the best for the children and youth in our lives. So the next portion here is just looking at the distinct intersections between diet culture and eating disorders, as well as mental health more broadly. So, diet culture can negatively impact mental health by fueling anxious thoughts, so obsessing about what you should or shouldn't eat, planning your meals, ruminating over mistakes that you made with eating, all those types of things. Diet culture can also trigger feelings of shame, guilt, embarrassment, and fear. And this is because weight loss and diets are on a massive pedestal. And as a result, individuals, again, assume that they're failing if they can't adhere to these really rigid standards. Um, Diet culture also has the ability to affect your relationships, as well as discouraging, individuals from taking important risks or trying new activities, again, because, there's this feeling that you might not have the right appearance for it or that type of thing. And it also can oftentimes encourage engaging in dangerous solutions. So, drugs, alcohol, laxatives, purging, and over-exercising, oftentimes all just to compensate for eating. And lastly, it can be, distracting from work, school, or other responsibilities. So with all that being said, tonight we're looking specifically at the ways that we can be engaging with children using an anti-diet philosophy. So here we have two primary objectives. The first being, helping kids to develop a core belief that their worth as a human does not rest on their appearance, on their weight, or how they eat. And then the second being, supporting children in finding ways of eating that are pleasant, nourishing, and as much as possible, internally driven. So when we're looking at the ways, that diet and exercise culture impact children and youth, the goal or the ideal here is to be setting a lifelong foundation for healthy habits and eating without fear or guilt. And so most often, babies are born eating intuitively. There are, of course, exceptions to this where some babies do have developmental issues that can preclude them from engaging, with food in this way. But generally, babies will naturally engage with food in their own way. And so, capitalizing on those skills and maintaining that innate pattern is one way in which diet culture can really impact children and youth. And even at the pediatricians or the doctor's office, well-meaning health professionals can unintentionally reinforce oversimplified ideas about health and weight. And because diet culture can become so synonymous with health and nutrition, it's really difficult to differentiate between the two. And lastly, as I stated before, parental and familial influences, peers, health professionals, and caregivers can all influence children and youth's view of food and exercise and health in general. And so, because of the factors discussed before, it's really important that whenever capacity we are engaging with children and youth, we're making attempts at instilling a positive relationship with food. So, here's some ideas and sort of ways in which that we can be, combating or resisting diet culture and act in a more anti-diet way when interacting with young people. And with these, it's important to keep in mind that parents and adults who engage with children and youth on a regular basis are often attempting to do the best that they can. And so when we speak about these topics, again, there's often those conflicting messages, and therefore it's really impossible to apply all of these pieces perfectly. And so this isn't an exhaustive list in any way, and there's many approaches to diet and exercise culture that can be used amongst youth. And so that being said, each individual's experience is nuanced, and different kids will have different needs depending on who they are, especially we would consider neurodivergent or developmental differences. For example, those with picky eating, with avoidant and or restrictive food intake, otherwise known as ARFID, or autism, allergies, intolerances. There's lots of different factors that can play a role, and so some of these ideas might work for some and might not work for others. But to start off, the first point being it's important to teach and respect the difference between hunger and fullness cues. So often the clean plate strategy, which is sort of this idea that a child needs to finish their plate completely before being able to leave the table or before being able to have dessert, ultimately doesn't encourage a positive relationship with food. So part of eating development is learning when you're hungry and full and then eating accordingly. Encouraging, listening to our bodies, eating when hungry, and then stopping when full is the ideal. And so respecting, the child's hunger levels is really important within this type of encouragement. So this idea of, take one more bite sort of overrides a child's, natural hunger and fullness cues. And it's important to remember that appetites do vary greatly from meal to meal and even day to day. And so therefore, we need to help children just develop their own trust in their own internal hunger and fullness cues. And evidence actually supports the idea that we shouldn't be, pressuring or forcing kids to eat anything, especially the things that you actually hope that they will eat. Leaning on kids to eat healthy foods can work for some families in the short term, but it's not actually likely to promote more intake of them in the long term when that pressure isn't applied. In addition to the idea surrounding hunger and fullness cues, again, we're wanting to view these ideas through more of the nuance of each individual child and acknowledge that there are some difficulties with some children over others in terms of monitoring cues. So, for example, children with ADHD or autism might experience differences in terms of monitoring their own hunger cues. We're also wanting to model a good relationship with food. And so, with this idea, it's important to note that, again, we do all have our own relationship with food, and it can be really complicated. And so, ideally, just doing your best to model these good examples with food is important, but it's sometimes easier said than done. So, the first kind of point that's really important is modeling what it looks like to eat with joy. So respecting your body and trying to eat in a way that's satisfying, nourishing, and pleasurable. Creating a positive environment around food when you lead by example is really important for children, as well as listening to your own hunger cues and then discussing this with the child. Eating meals together also, gives opportunity to see how family can enjoy meals together without, guilt or anxiety, and also, emphasizing the fact that this is a time for conversation and enjoyment of each other's company. So having a relaxed vibe around food is more likely to provide the child to have a more relaxed idea of food as well. And it's also important that, with this idea, every meal doesn't have to be perfect. So by this, I mean that, every meal doesn't necessarily have to have the exact balance of all the food groups, and it doesn't need to have vegetables, and it doesn't need to have fruit all the time. Over time, it will likely balance out. And with this, some studies have actually demonstrated that when most kids are given options, they'll end up meeting their nutritional needs over time, not necessarily within each meal specifically, but just on a more general basis. And additionally, with this idea of modeling a positive relationship, because eating behaviors and body image can often be so tied, it's equally as important to be attempting to model body comfort. So having anxiety surrounding your own body is likely to translate to a child's body. And because children are sponges and absorb many of those thoughts and feelings that are shared with them, it's important that we try to avoid, relaying body discomfort or lack of body acceptance, because the child is likely to take that on. And so a way to combat this could even be, normalizing conversations about body comfort and ensuring just that there's open dialogue. So another factor is, again, wanting to create that positive mealtime environment. So mealtime battles are common, and because of this, precious family time can be overtaken by arguments about a child's eating, instead of meals being about a positive connection and chatting about the day. So pressuring a child to eat more or less can significantly increase their level of mealtime anxiety, making mealtime, more difficult for anxious and cautious eaters. It can also steer them away from listening to their innate hunger cues and their fullness signals, and being relaxed enough to respond to those things. And so again, aiming for that open communication regarding eating and food is really important, and trying to keep those food comments to yourself and just spend mealtime simply connecting. By offering, a variety of foods that work for your budget and cultural preferences, and giving children the space to decide for themselves what they'll eat from what's offered without pressure or praise. And it's really helpful to also be curious about changes in your child's eating. So when you do observe changes in their eating, it could be a sign of concern, such as anxiety or depression, or possibly an eating disorder. And so we're never wanting to just assume that your child is not at risk for an eating disorder solely based on appearance. Children of all sizes across the weight spectrum, genders, races, and abilities can develop eating disorders. And so because of this, it's really important to both never praise a child for weight loss, but also paying close attention and being mindful of if they are or aren't getting enough to eat in general. And when we speak about mealtime dynamics, it's equally as important to consider some of the other factors that can make this difficult or create barriers to doing so, such as interpersonal conflicts or different mealtime problems that could occur or food insecurity. And so, as a caveat that goes with a lot of these ideas, it's totally understandable if this can't be done perfectly all the time or if it can't be done at all. Another important component of fostering a positive relationship with food is involving participation with food preparation. So, engaging with children at the grocery store with you to see and pick out different foods is a really helpful way to have a child understand food a bit better. Another way of doing this is to have them choose part of your dinner, or maybe even standing at the counter to help prepare it. And so, involving kids in these processes can give them a sense of control and independence while learning about different foods. And the more meal planning, shopping, and preparation that they're involved in, the more likely they'll be to try a variety of foods. There's also a sense of pride and ownership that comes with seeing a meal, dish, or baking project from start to finish, and it creates opportunities to speak with children about what healthy and flexible relationships with food might look like. And so, with this sort of involvement with food preparation and food selection, we're also given the opportunity to provide knowledge, education, and factual information regarding nutrition and food choice with the potential to debunk any confusing thoughts surrounding diet culture ideas. Oftentimes, again, the more interaction and engagement with kids in food prep, the more questions could, can, or will come up, and therefore offer the chance to address marketing and foster kids' ability to critically analyze advertising, confusing diet and exercise messages, and things like that. And then we're also wanting to sympathize with children and youth and consider their opinions regarding a lot of these matters. So listening to the child's concerns and acknowledging the reality of their feelings with regards to eating, as well as body image concerns, is an effective response to addressing these issues. A natural response is often to attempt to make children feel better and counter their comments with compliments or reasoning it away. But instead, listening with empathy without immediately using solution-focused responses is a great way to recognize how they're feeling and be there for them. So oftentimes, children really need parents or caregivers to just listen to them express their feelings about their experiences. So asking questions and helping them understand their own feelings is really important. And again, these conversations are very context dependent, but oftentimes they can present the opportunity to acknowledge how, fat phobia is systemic and the origins of a lot of the feelings that they might be having are out of their control sometimes. And so with that, even, being candid and disclosing your own lived experiences with these feelings can allow for some really fruitful moments too. So in terms of things that we want to do our best avoiding or, preventing, using food as a reward is a really big one. So oftentimes there's this temptation to leverage liked foods as rewards, and using desserts or other, unhealthy foods as a reward might actually be making them a bit more desirable because it's showing that these items are something to be sought after. And so oftentimes there's, an association made between certain foods with certain activities and places. So, this idea of maybe going to the dentist might mean getting ice cream afterwards, which again creates the sort of reward system associated with that place or event. And then there's also foods that are oftentimes withheld as punishment. So again, this leads to that connection of certain foods to certain emotions. And so the ideal is to be using non-food rewards, essentially anything that doesn't pertain to food as an incentive if needed. And again, as all of these points, it should be noted that oftentimes parents and or childcare providers do feel at a loss for how to navigate children's behaviors and do have to rely on this as a strategy. And so it's important that we validate how difficult it can be maybe avoiding doing this, and sometimes it's impossible to get it right every time or do it perfectly. And then another point here is avoiding, making any foods completely off limits. So it can be really tempting to label foods as good or bad, or healthy or unhealthy, but evaluating food is not a black and white item. So all foods can be incorporated into a healthful diet. Foods higher nutritional value are just as important as, lesser nutritional foods. And so treats can be a part of the diet. And again, we have this idea that setting something off limits really does result in it feeling more desirable. So when foods are given a lot of power as, special or forbidden, kids might choose to eat more of these foods when you're not around, hide or sneak them, or learn to feel guilty about themselves for even wanting them. And, even just the threat of deprivation has been shown to lead to binge eating. And so encouraging, again, that balance amongst food actually prevents binging. And so, because of this, it's really important, again, to try to not police any foods. And that also includes sugar. There's a lot of ideas around sugar addiction, and that makes caregivers very anxious. And there's not actually a lot of strong scientific evidence to support sugar addiction in humans. And it's actually only seen in animal studies where access to sugar has been restricted. And so, again, in terms of food being off limits, this is, of course, with the exception of allergies or intolerances or religious considerations, where some families are halal or kosher or things like that. And it's also important to avoid labeling foods as good or bad. So all foods can fit within a healthy diet. There's a time and place for all foods, and no one should be made to feel guilty for enjoying a less nutrient-dense food. Children and adults as well shouldn't be made to feel virtuous for eating vegetables or, immoral for not. And so, off limits or bad foods creates sort of this forbidden complex and can lead to more severe issues, again, like hiding food, eating in secret, or overeating when we do allow the food just this once. And so, as an alternative to categorizing and making statements about good or bad foods, it's sometimes helpful to make statements like, eating fish makes our brain smart, or baking cookies together is such a fun treat. Healthy relationships with foods shouldn't require restrictions. And again, that's with the exception of allergies and sensitivities and religious or cultural guidelines. This labeling of junk food, good, bad, healthy, unhealthy, all is setting the stage for people to restrict, sneak, and overindulge in these foods that are deemed forbidden. And so we can also look at it as sort of reframing the idea as, always foods or sometimes foods even. That's another way to sort of teach balance. So fruits and vegetables could be always foods, and cookies and cakes should be sometimes foods. But again, avoiding having any sweets or treats or fun foods in the home, or steering kids clear of these issues can set kids up for overindulgence on the rare occasions when they do have access to these types of foods, and then, feeling guilty for doing so. So moving on to exercise in children, we're going to look at how exercise culture can impact children and youth. So exercise culture and how it operates can foster a negative association with movement, and therefore it can, be sort of disincentivizing to young children and youth. Forceful or punitive physical activity will also result in this negative association. And, more generally speaking, young children don't need structured strength training programs, especially because oftentimes play is exercise for them. And so it doesn't need to be as stressed as it often is made to be. So in terms of fostering a positive relationship with exercise, it's really important that in whatever capacity we are engaging with children and youth, we're making attempts at, incorporating some of these value sets. And these are just some ideas, again, on how to combat or resist fitness or exercise culture and act in a more inclusive way. So in terms of things that we can be doing, finding activities that make children and youth feel powerful. So exercise and physical activities can be amazing tools to get in touch with your body. So encouraging children and youth to find activities that do get them moving and helping to see all the amazing things their body can do is a really great starting point. We also want to acknowledge and celebrate that bodies look and work differently. So it's important to recognize that bodies aren't all meant to work or look the same. We're all different in so many ways, and it's counterproductive to pretend that we're not. Humans come in a wide variety of skin tones, heights, weights, and we all have different birthmarks, hair loss, visible disabilities, and many other distinguishing features. And so those differences are very real, and it's important that, we're not avoiding questions from a child who might ask about different body differences and body diversity, and learning that it's not a shameful topic or something that's off limits. The third point here is, wanting to think about choice of language, and that's especially if, you might be a coach or someone that teaches a physical skill. So considering how language may be communicating negative messages about bodies in your own sport is a really important reflection piece. And then thinking about how you might be unconsciously, responding differently to young athletes based on their bodies, and then challenging those preconceptions. So it's kind of this idea that, if they're building skills and achieving the goals that they are meant to be in the sport, then it shouldn't really matter what someone's body looks like. We're also wanting to emphasize the non-competitive perks of sport. So when kids begin participating in a more competitive setting or playing on teams that only define success as a win, it's important to challenge that mentality and remind kids that fitness is about so much more than the final outcome. Moving doesn't have to be one thing. So asking children and youth, how they feel afterwards is a really great way to highlight this. If you can help children and youth see the connection between moving and feeling good, you're helping them learn more about their own mind-body connection. And then trying to avoid becoming overly focused on competitive sport as the only major form of exercise, just because it can become a little bit problematic. So instead attempting to focus on health and well-being instead of success or achievement attached to the sport. Interest in competitive sport often evolves naturally from general enjoyment of physical activity, and so we don't want to see exercise strictly as just, again, that way to win. Sports and exercise should be seen in the context of the whole person's development and not simply just be an end to itself. And with this, focusing on, again, those skills-based accomplishments rather than wins, or definitely not numbers like calories burned or pounds lost. It's a really effective way to sort of emphasize skills instead. And then we're also wanting to separate exercise from physical appearance. So, again, our thin obsessed culture results in children believing that the purpose of exercise is to obtain a thin body or to lose weight or to, achieve a certain physical appearance. And so detaching the two ideas from each other, again, by having those conversations and being mindful of the language you use around children is really important. And then relatedly, talking about physical activity in a positive way. So again, this sort of modeling piece, examining our own attitudes towards exercise and working through harmful tendencies, as well as being mindful of communication you use about physical activity in front of children. Again, those really small comments can have lasting impacts on children, especially as they're developing beliefs about body image, whether that be, satisfaction or dissatisfaction. And so if an adult is discussing exercises as a chore or as a negative experience, it's likely to be internalized that way by the child. And so instead, making an effort to talk about movement in a very positive way and highlighting how it makes them feel good physically and mentally is important. And also speaking about, the enjoyment that can come from physical activity. And then as for things to avoid doing, it's important to not use exercise in the context of shame or punishment. Rather than relieving stress, it actually makes movement inherently more stressful and negative. So exercise should not be something that's dreaded, but something that, the individual feels self-motivated to pursue. And with this, it's really important to avoid body shaming as a way to motivate kids to get moving. Inducing feelings of shame and insecurity about one's body will backfire in terms of the child's willingness to engage in physical activity. So, not showing judgment and even maybe avoiding suggesting, that they're doing something wrong when they're engaging with the sport, because, again, that makes it just that little bit less enjoyable for them. And then the final point here is to definitely avoid forcing a child to engage in vigorous physical activity or a specific activity or program against their will. So our last piece of tonight is just looking at the additional ways that we can be combating diet and exercise culture. And so the main idea here is advocacy in a few different forms. So caregivers, educators, parents, healthcare professionals, all have such a huge opportunity to show children and youth how to question what they hear, be critical about what they're taught, what they read, and what they observe. And so in particular, advocacy with health professionals and other influences is a really important component of this. So, making sure that other adults and caregivers are on the same page. Harmful messages can come from, even babysitters, coaches, co-parents, and grandparents. And so it's helpful to sort of identify who other important adults are in the child's life and discussing that anti-diet philosophy and the importance of it, because we're really wanting to reinforce supportive and validating messaging, helping, again, to build that resilience against diet culture. And that being said, that portion of it is a little bit difficult of an action to follow through with. So we can be making attempts at engaging with others and educating them, but we can't necessarily change other people's minds. And so with that, there's also this idea of challenging authority figures when necessary and promoting advocacy with professionals. And so, for example, that could look like requesting that BMI and weight are not emphasized as health indicators for a child. Some doctors might not be aware that BMI, especially, is not a reliable indicator of health and has a long problematic history. Unfortunately, we don't have, again, time enough for that topic, but it is very much steeped in racism. And so, keeping in mind that doctors might not always know best, and they themselves have weight bias, and are very much a part of the diet culture society. So being a child's voice when other well-meaning authorities are discussing things like counting calories or a child's weight or body size, those are all sort of a part of the advocacy piece. So just being really mindful of those sort of sentiments. And then in addition to that, there's also, for much younger children, ways to remove weight stigma from even the pediatrician's office. So some pediatricians will still recommend weight loss programs, or sometimes will gently encourage, eating more fruits and vegetables or getting exercise, which again are seemingly harmless interventions, but in actuality, they might be instilling these morality beliefs around food, around exercise, and having this, right way to have a body. Doctors or pediatricians shouldn't really be expecting children to grow in an exact linear fashion, and so there's not really a need to discuss BMI with children at annual physicals. Most children will grow predictably when given a structure and autonomy around food and exercise. And so, a child might deviate from their growth curve, and if this does persist, it's really important to be consulting with, non-diet, health at every size, intuitive eating professionals instead. It also might be important or helpful for parents or whoever it might be to talk to children ahead of time about stigma that they might encounter. And some parents find it helpful to even offer a script to children to sort of dismiss medical weight talk. And that being said, that has its own risks and its own caveats to it, because we want to create balance, obviously, in having confidence in the medical system as well. And so, as I mentioned before, consulting with non-diet, health at every size, intuitive eating professionals is really ideal. And so with that, educating oneself regarding health at every size, intuitive eating value sets is really important. And so having that open communication with children about all these items that we discussed tonight is sort of vital. You obviously don't have to convince children that you know everything, but really highlighting critical skills for what they hear about food and health, so that when diet messaging does surround them, they can pause before taking it at face value. So that does conclude tonight's webinar. These are some additional resources that pertain to intuitive eating and weight stigma, some of which are specific to children and youth, and then some of them are more general. And then attached here as well are some resources for getting support with eating disorders more generally. And like I mentioned before, these webinar slides are included in the email you received with tonight's Zoom link, as well as I believe they're in the chat, and then will be sent afterwards as well. So lots of access to the slides and these resources.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Kelsey, for this informative presentation. We do have about 7 minutes for questions. So if anyone does have a question, please feel free to throw it in the chat. You can also use the raise hand function and say your question out loud, just knowing that your voice will be a part of the recording. So we'll give it a couple of minutes. In the meantime, I will throw into the chat an anonymous feedback form. So we would love your feedback on this webinar, anything that you liked, anything that you think could be improved. There will also be a link to this in the follow-up email that will be sent right at 6 o'clock. That will include this survey as well as another copy of the slides. So we'll hang around for the next 5 minutes or so to see if anyone has any questions. Okay, I have one. I think it was just sent to me in the chat. So I will start by reading that one out. Um, so this person is asking, I'll kind of summarize. Essentially, they're already noticing like some self-critical behaviors on the part of their daughter. So kind of looking in the mirror, pointing out things that they don't like. If that's sort of already happening at a young age, do you have any advice for this person?
Yeah. I mean, I think that that's obviously a very broad question in terms of I can't give, any prescriptive or definitive advice, especially without, knowing the child or knowing the full scope of the scenario. Um, I think, I think the starting point oftentimes is opening that line of communication. So, being curious and having conversations with the child about what they're feeling and about what thoughts they're having, as well as looking at the sources for those feelings or the origins of where all those ideas might be coming from. Aside from that, I think that it would be really context dependent and um, it would be determined by the individual child. But I think generally communication would be a great starting point.
Thanks, Kelsey. I think often there's also this sort of instinct, whether it's a child or a friend of ours or a family member, to like counter what they're saying. So let's say the comment that they make is really based in fat phobia, to say, "Oh no, you're not fat." Or that can be like this instinct because we want to make the person feel better, but of course remembering that that is very much grounded in fat phobia as well, right? Because if we're countering that by saying like, "Oh no, you're not," we're reinforcing this idea that fat is bad and that thin is good. So kind of keeping in mind too what those automatic reactions might bring up. I also have a suggestion, and this I think we forgot to actually include this on our resource list, but this book was recommended, which is really important, called "Fearing the Black Body: The Racial Origins of Fat Phobia" by Sabrina Strings. So this is a really great resource that goes very in depth into the history of fat phobia and describes how it truly is based in anti-Black racism, as well as the context of religion and slavery, as opposed to concerns about health, which is often what we assume. Any other questions for Kelsey? Okay, I don't see any others coming through. So I'm going to stop the recording now. And thank you so much, everyone, for being here this evening. Any final words, Kelsey?
No, I think that's it. Thank you so much for attending, and yeah,